Well, hi there, everybody. Welcome to one of this month's community gatherings. My name's Paul Roop. I'm the president of HumanistsMN. I use he, him pronouns. If you want to share yours with me, I hope you'll feel comfortable doing so. I'm very happy to see everybody here today. I'm very excited to see everybody here today. It's my genuine hope that one day, if it's not today, maybe one day, you'll be able to look around this room and see other people that you can say, these are my people. And if that happens for you, I think it'll be because you find people who are compassionate, you find people who are reason-based, and people who are curious. And there's lots of different places and things that you can do with HumanistsMN to find that type of thing. Whether it's volunteering, packing food, cleaning up highways, going to one of our social gatherings, all sorts of different things that you can do. Getting involved civically or socially. There's all sorts of ways that you can get involved with our organization. There's a table right at the back, just to the kind of left-hand side of the door in the middle. If you're interested, go and check it out. HumanistsMN is a secular community for ethical living. We believe in building great lives in the here and now. So with that being said, I have a few notes. So one of those notes is at the end of this. There's going to be a little social time at the end, as well as some books available in the back. And I hope that you'll join us, and that is going to start, I think, around 4:30. If you need a restroom, those are going to be out the doors to the back and to the left. And there's another set of bathrooms down the stairs and also to the left. And I'm not entirely sure actually who I'm handing this off to, but somebody else has a couple of things left to say. So, was that Suzanne? Yes, yes.
Yeah, hello, everybody. My name is Suzanne Perry, and I'm on the program committee here, and I'm going to introduce our speaker today. But first, I do have a couple of other items to talk about. We have a few upcoming events that I want to tell you about. One is on December 6th. We're going to hear from Leo Igwe, who's a Nigerian humanist, and he's going to talk about the role of religion in Africa. He'll talk about the prevalence of witch hunting and at the same time, the growth of humanism. On January 17th, we're going to hold our second annual Religious Freedom Forum, where we will explore the true meaning of religious freedom. Hint, it does not mean the license to promote religious privilege. We'll hear from Fish Stark at that event. He's the executive director of the American Humanist Association. We'll have a lunch where we present the Religious Freedom Champion Award to Representative Mike Freiberg. We'll have a panel of other Minnesota legislators. And late-breaking news is we're also going to have Reverend Susie Hayward, who's a co-host, along with our speaker today, of the podcast American Unexceptionalism. And this explores what Americans can learn from people in other countries who are fighting battles like we are against religious nationalism and authoritarianism. So save the date, that's January 17th, right here at FUS. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Matthew D. Taylor is a senior Christian scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, and an expert in American Christianity, American Islam, Christian extremism, and religion and politics. His book, The Violent Take It by Force, The Christian Movement That is Threatening Our Democracy, tracks how a network of Christian leaders called the New Apostolic Reformation was a major instigating force for the January 6th insurrection, and is currently reshaping the culture of the religious right in the U.S. I encourage you to read the book, and it is for sale back there. I did, and I was amazed to learn about the extent of this network of passionate, highly organized people who are working to influence our politics and who think people like us are under the influence of demons. But we hear very little about this in the mainstream media. Matt is co-host of the podcast I mentioned earlier, American Unexceptionalism. He's often quoted in the media about the New Apostolic Reformation and Christian extremism. We're very lucky to have him come to Minneapolis. Before I bring him up to the stage, just a few words about the format. Matt will speak for 45 or so minutes, then we'll open it up to questions. If you want to ask a question, we're going to be distributing cards that you can fill out. Stephanie will have some, and Paul will have others. So just flag them. They'll be walking up and down, and you can get the card from them and ask the questions. And then, as Paul said, we'll break at 4:30 for a reception, and Matt will be signing his book. So now, please welcome Matt Taylor to Minnesota.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. As a Christian, I've actually always wondered when atheists gather. I know Christians gather on Sunday morning, and Muslims have prayer on Friday afternoon, and Jews usually gather on Shabbat. And so I found my answer. It's at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. So thank you. Great to be here. I should say at the top, just because we were talking about politics and extremism, that I am not speaking on behalf of anyone, my employer or HumanistsMN or anyone else. These are my views that I'll be sharing today. Let me give a quick outline for where we're going to go this afternoon. I want to cover a lot. So we're going to start with a pop quiz because I need to figure out what you all already know. And I'll let you all do this together. You can I'll grade you as a class. And then we're going to try to think about this question of what is Christian nationalism? What does that phrase mean? And is that an adequate category for describing the crisis that we are experiencing right now? And then I want to talk a little bit about how is Christian extremism growing in the United States in the Trump era. And we'll spend most of our time on that. And then at the very end, I want to come back to this question of what we can do about this. What is an adequate response to the crisis? Ready? All right, so let's start with a pop quiz. So question number 1, who is this woman and what does she do? You shout it out. Paula White. Also Paula White Kane, she got remarried in 2015. What does she do? Spiritual advisor to Donald Trump. She's also the director of the White House Faith Office. Good, full credit, good job. Question number 2, this grandfatherly looking man is a pastor. Why is he important? Doug Wilson, good. Not J.D. Vance, close. Pete Hegseth, yes. So Doug Wilson is a very prominent person. We'll get to him in a little bit, but he's also very influential over our Secretary of Defense, who wants to be called a Secretary of War. All right, great. A little bit of a harder question. Who is Jehu, and why would anyone compare him to Trump? We got Donald Trump, an American Jehu. The Jehu prophecy, the Jehu principle. No? He was a king of Israel, yes, yes.
That was used by the religious folks, even though it was very faulty.
Somewhat, yeah. I'll give you all half credit on that question. Yeah. Good, all right. Yes, well, we'll get to Jehu. Don't worry, we'll get there. Yeah, so what we have so far is he was a former king of Israel, ancient Israel, and who played some role in ancient Israel. Who is this man, and what does he do? Sean Foyt, good. What does he do? Sing. You can see him with his guitar there. He also hangs out with Donald Trump and Charlie Kirk fairly frequently. Yes, he sings. What kind of singing does he do? He's a worship leader. Yes, a very prominent Christian nationalist worship leader today. All right, good, full credit. Question 5. What do these tattoos on our Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth signal? So there's the one, if you can't see, the one in the center there is on his chest, and it's got 4 crosses around a larger cross. The one on his bicep is Deus Vult, and then the one on kind of the underside of his right arm, this is very recent, and within the last year that he got, says kafir in Arabic. Anyone know what kafir means? Infidel, yeah, an unbeliever. What does Deus Vult mean? God wills it. Okay, good. You've decoded them enough. So what do they mean? What is he signaling with these tattoos? Holy War. Holy War. Yeah, Deus Vult was the slogan of the Crusades. And
so sorry to
yeah.
interrupt, but we have someone's car is about to be towed. Can I just
Sure.
briefly? It is a maroon Honda Passport with the license tag LUR253. You're just past the red mark on the driveway. The tow truck's not here yet, but we don't want that to happen to you. And I'm so sorry.
That's right. That's right. So the cross on Hegseth's chest is actually called the Jerusalem cross. It was one of the symbols of the Crusades. And the term kafir is what Islamic jihadists will often call their enemies, including Muslims that are their enemies. And so it's kind of a come at me, bro, kind of a taunt towards Muslims. All right, great. You all are doing well. What is this flag and what does it mean? It's a white flag, has the phrase an appeal to heaven across the top, and it's got a green pine tree at the center of it.
That's the Seven Mountains Mandate?
It's connected to the Seven Mountains Mandate, but it's not coterminous with the Seven Mountains Mandate.
From the Revolutionary War.
It's a Revolutionary War flag.
It has something to do with Christian nationalism.
All right, half credit. All right, last question. Here's question number 7. So Opus Dei, that was just a scary thing that they invented for the Da Vinci Code, right? That's not a real thing, is it? Yes. All right, good job. You guys did well on our little quiz. So all of these symbols and figures we've just talked about are all tied up with what we call American Christian nationalism. And if we're trying to kind of give a very simple definition, you could think back to your high school biology classes to the kind of kingdom, phylum, system of categorization, right? These kind of orders. And if we started at the family of phenomena that we find called religious nationalisms, and there's many forms of religious nationalism, then within that, the genus would be Christian nationalisms. And you can find Christian nationalisms around the world. There's Christian nationalism in Russia that looks different than Christian nationalism in Hungary, that looks different than Christian nationalism in Nigeria, all of which look very different than Christian nationalism looks in the United States. And so when we get down to the species level, then we can start to begin to speak about the different species of Christian nationalism that we find in the United States. And there are actually a number of them. It's not a single or homogenous phenomenon. And globally right now, as Suzanne was calling attention to, I have a podcast that's airing right now about this. Right now, we are experiencing a surge globally in the growth of religious nationalisms. So what is happening here in the United States is just one outpost of a global trend that links together religious nationalism, populist authoritarianism, and far-right politics. And this is on the rise with Hindu nationalism in India, the so-called Hindutva movement, with Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, with religious Zionism in Israel. Not all Zionism is religious. In fact, the early Zionism was actually quite secular. But now we have forms of religious Zionism that are on the rise in Israel and are really affecting Israeli politics today. We have Islamic nationalism on the rise in Turkey and in Syria. And then, as I was saying, we have Christian nationalism kind of emerging all over the place, but there are different forms of it. So I want to pose the question as we're getting started, should we be worried about all Christian nationalism? Is all Christian nationalism a cause for concern? So we find in survey questions that are asked, and this one was done by Pew Research Center in 2022, do you think the U.S. should be a Christian nation? 51% of our country said no, 45% said yes. So the headline is 45% of the United States is Christian nationalist. That's scary. Almost half of our fellow citizens are religious extremists. But then someone who answers yes to that question could mean really at least one of three things. They could mean that Christians make up the majority of the US population, which has always been true. Up until the 1990s, it was about 90% of the country was identifying as Christian. Today it's around 62%, but it's still the majority Christian nation. So maybe they're just being descriptive. Now they could mean something more historical and philosophical about the founding of the United States. And there's all this mythology out there in Christian communities and Christian media about how the founders were these profoundly devoted Christians. They really weren't. About how much they really cared about infusing Christianity into the ethos of the United States. They really didn't. And about how much they intended for this to be a Christian nation. A few of them cared very deeply about that. But the majority of the founding fathers, this was not really a priority for them. It was a very secular age, in fact, when our country was founded coming out of the Enlightenment. But many Christians believe it is. And then they could mean that Christians and or Christianity should be privileged over other communities and other worldviews in the United States, and that is anti-democratic Christian supremacy. Now what you find, so the first question, right, 45% say the U.S. should be a Christian nation. But then Pew, I think wisely, asked some follow-up questions. Questions like, should the Supreme Court justices bring their own religious views into how they decide major cases? So if 45% said yes, it should be a Christian nation, only 15% said yes to that. Right? Or in another survey from 2024 that Pew asked, how many American adults say the federal government should declare Christianity the official religion? Only 13% said yes. Let's get rid of the First Amendment. Let's have an established religion, right? So yeah, that's concerning that more than a tenth of our countrymen and countrywomen would agree that we need to get rid of one of the pillars of our Constitution. Then another 44% in that survey said no, the government should not declare itself to be a Christian nation, but the government should promote Christian values. Now, the crucial question is which Christian values, right? Because some Christians would say, stopping abortion, discriminating against gay people, those are Christian values. But I think a lot of people would say, love your neighbor, do justice, care for the poor, right? Now, I do not particularly want our federal government to be teaching us Christian values, but I'm also not terribly concerned about Christians saying, I want the government to enforce love your neighbor. Right? Now, then the remainder, that 39% says no, none of the above, right? So there's this delta that we see between that 13 to 15% of the US population that when they keep asking the questions that get more and more extreme, they keep saying yes, 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 versus that larger 45 up to 60% of the US population that wants some form of Christianity, and at least notionally in their country, but are not willing to go there. So how do we tell the difference between dangerous Christian nationalists from these more benign ones who might just be trying to be descriptive or sentimental? What you find in just about every survey that's been done on Christian nationalism, and there have been many, many surveys in recent years on this, is that really Christian nationalism is a spectrum of views in the United States. It's not a single or monolithic phenomenon. At one end of the spectrum, we have more passive and democratic and even sentimental styles of Christian nationalism. I call these folks the God Bless America kind of Christian nationalists. They like the song. They don't necessarily know what it means, but they like the song. And I know people, maybe some of you in this room, who when you see an American flag in the front chancel of a church, you say, that's offensive. You're blending your national identity and your religion. I grew up going to a church like that. The other night I was speaking at a church like that about Christian nationalism. So that is a form of Christian nationalism, right? You're bringing a national symbol into your religious space and putting it up front in a position of prominence next to your religious symbols. It's not one that keeps me up at night. That is not a grave threat to our democracy. That's been something that Christians have been doing for hundreds of years. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we get into some of these very hardline forms of Christian nationalism, where they're more organized, more anti-democratic, and more theological. And this is where we start getting into some real danger. So here you have an American flag alongside a Christian flag on the front lines of January 6th. That is a real threat to our democracy. Now here's the challenge. Soft Christian nationalists and hardline Christian nationalists, what I call Christian supremacists, will often vote the same way. But there's a difference in severity in the way that they think about these things. People on this side might be persuadable. People on that side are not. So how do we figure out who's persuadable and who isn't? And so when we talk about radicalization in the Christian community, and I think we should use this term radicalization. Many times this is only applied to Muslim communities, and I think in a very distortive way. We need to talk about radicalization within the Christian community, and when we talk about that, it's about people moving along the spectrum, moving from these more kind of gateway drug styles of Christian nationalism into the hard stuff, into the dangerous stuff, right? And the things that are radicalizing American Christians today are things like conspiracy theories. Some of this is happening through biblical reinterpretation. Some of this is happening through modern prophecies. Some of this is happening through very erudite forms of philosophy and theology that's quite cerebral and intelligent. All of those things are pushing people along the spectrum and further into these kind of extreme ideologies. Now, right now, I would say in the United States, we have three major strands of Christian supremacy. And I want to outline each of these for you a little bit because I think it's important that we understand them, that we understand the differences among them, and that we recognize how all of these are intersecting with our current administration. So the first form is what we could call anti-Vatican II Catholic traditionalism. I'll go through these in more depth in just a second. And there you see a picture of Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, along with his close friend J.D. Vance. And these two have been in the news this week if you've been paying attention. The second form would be this Reformed, aka Calvinist, Reconstructionist Christian nationalism. This is a more Protestant style. And this is where you find Doug Wilson, who we talked about, and we'll get into him a little bit more. And also Pete Hegseth is very much influenced and inspired by this camp. And then the third camp, where we'll spend most of our time this afternoon, is the independent, charismatic, spiritual warfare activists. And this is where most of my research tends to focus. So I want to go through each of these in a little bit of depth, just so you have some sense for the different types of theology that is driving our country mad right now. So let's talk about the Catholics a little bit. So within the Catholic Church, there was a major set of reforms that went on globally in the 1960s, called the Second Vatican Council, often shorthanded as Vatican II. And these reforms had a major impact on global Catholicism. This is what basically brought to an end the practice of using Latin in the Mass. This is why Mass is now performed in vernacular most of the time, that whatever the language of the community itself. It opened up the Catholic Church to more interreligious and interfaith dialogue, especially with Jews and with Muslims. And it also downplayed the power of clericalism, the attachment of authority to people who are ordained. And so since that time, since the 1960s, there's been a backlash against this set of reforms that happened, perhaps most prominently with the formation of the Society of St. Pius X, led by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. This is the radical traditionalist wing of Catholicism. And the Society of Pius X at different points has been excommunicated from the church. They've taken some quite extreme positions in different spaces. Now, within the church, this impulse towards radical traditionalism manifests in an effort to elevate these kind of far-right ideological priests to help them become bishops and then archbishops and move up the hierarchy. Now, though in the political terms, in the kind of political realm, this manifests more as an alliance that many far-right Catholics will make with far-right Protestants, with far-right Eastern Orthodox folks, and even with neo-Nazis, to reclaim Catholicism from this shift, this modernization, this liberalization they perceive to be happening through the Vatican Council. Now, where do we see this today? Well, we see this in this organization Opus Dei that was not made up for the Da Vinci Code. It's a real thing. It's a real order within the Catholic Church. In fact, there are rumors right now circulating within Opus Dei that Pope Leo may disband Opus Dei, which would be an earthquake in far-right Catholicism. It would not make Opus Dei disappear. It might drive it underground more, but it would be a huge shift in the life of Catholicism because the Opus Dei is a very, very influential network and very well-funded network within the Catholic Church. Related to Opus Dei, we have this guy, Leonard Leo, who's very influenced by Opus Dei. He is kind of the architect of the conservative Supreme Court, the conservative Catholic Supreme Court that we have, very close to Justices Alito and Thomas, but he also has a little bit of influence over people like Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh. In the executive branch, of course, J.D. Vance is a very prominent far-right Catholic. He's kind of their avatar within the administration on this front. And in the moderate range, this manifests, and we see this in people calling themselves post-liberal activists. This is kind of a buzzword within these far-right Catholic circles, post-liberal. There are also a number of constitutional law professors very immersed in this. They'll often talk about common good constitutionalism, which sounds perfectly lovely until you actually dig into it and realize their definition of common good is whatever we say is good is common for you, and you just need to get in line, right? And at the extreme end, this can manifest in outright neo-Nazism. And Nick Fuentes and the Groyper movement, if you've heard of that, is at the extreme edge. Fuentes is a Catholic and often speaks of his neo-Nazi ideas in Catholic terms. You also have militias in the U.S. that are tied up with this Polish neo-Nazi militia movement called the All Polish Youth. So it can have very, very dangerous manifestations as well. Now, in the Reconstructionist Calvinist camp, this is something that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s around a couple of theologians named R.J. Rushdoony, Rousas John Rushdoony, and his son-in-law Gary North. And this was very, very influential, although on a subterranean level, with the rise of the religious right. Many of the leaders who were helping to drive the rise of the religious right, people like Jerry Falwell and James Dobson, they were reading these guys. They were taking inspiration from these guys. And this form tends to be more intellectual and cerebral and theologically tied to Calvinism. So it's just kind of one strand of Protestantism that can really latch on to this one. And they created a concept in the 1960s called dominion theology. And the idea of dominion theology is that Christians should take dominion over every society in which they belong. And this is driven by a certain biblical interpretation. They also like to talk about theonomy. So theo, God, nomos, law, the application of biblical law to modern societies. So Rushdoony famously said or wrote, that it might not sound pleasant to everyone, but in the Bible, it says that we are supposed to stone homosexuals to death. And if you're living in a good Christian society that is realizing it, that should be what happens. quite extreme in their ideas and quite influential. Now, today where we see this, these folks, they are not quiet about what their agenda is. They hold big conferences called Blueprints for Christendom 2.0. Who knows what Christendom is? Good. Christendom is the idea that the physical domain and the people who live within it under Christian rulers. This is basically the idea of the borders of Christian empire. That is Christendom. And they're saying, and I'll just say as a Christian, that Christendom has been one of the most destructive ideas in human history. Christendom gave us crusades. Christendom gave us pogroms. Christendom has given us genocide and colonialism and slavery and racism. It has been a force of great harm in human history. And these folks are saying, giddy up, let's get 2.0. And this is a passage from a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism, written by somebody in this camp. It was published by Doug Wilson's press. This book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, it was written in part when Stephen Wolfe was doing his postdoctorate degree at Princeton University. So this is not fringe. This is not coming out of nowhere. This was written at one of the elite universities of our nation. Let me read for you a little bit from this. Non-Christians living among us, he's talking about his ideal Christian society. Non-Christians living among us are entitled to justice, peace, and safety, but they are not entitled to political equality. Nor do they have the right to deny the people of God their right to order civil institutions to God and to their complete good. We know what's good for you, and we will order society for your good. Congratulations. We lack the spirit for this sort of dominion today, a once uncontroversial spirit that animated the magisterial Protestant reformers and Christians prior to the Reformation. We must revitalize and return to it. The Christian's posture towards the earth ought to be that it is ours, not theirs, for we are co-heirs with Christ. That's the theology that is driving these folks. And in the moderate range, we find these kind of expressions through these people that are sometimes called the theobros, that you find, they troll you on Twitter, or they troll me on Twitter. They hold these big men's conferences, and all the men have these big beards. There's something about kind of masculinity that's very tied in with beards for them. And they'll talk openly about, we need a Christian monarch to rule over our society. In the extreme range, you can find some of these pastors outright endorsing racism. Wolfe comes right up to the edge of saying that interracial marriage should not be permissible in a Christian society in his book. They justify slavery and the Crusades, and they call for, they even understand the Crusades as a template for civilizational conflict. They call for the end of women voting. They say we need to repeal the 19th Amendment because, women just make our voting so liberal. And they get real close to playing footsie with Nazism at times. I want to talk and spend most of our time on this third strand, the independent charismatics. And here, when we use the term charismatic, we're using it in the Christian sense. So in kind of our general vocabulary, charismatic means somebody with a magnetic personality or a kind of attractive kind of qualities. Here we're using it in the Christian sense. This is a term that comes from the New Testament. The term charismata that we find in the New Testament, that refers to the gifts of the Holy Spirit or the graces of God. And so this is to be charismatic, this really begins with Pentecostalism in the early 20th century. But charismatic Christians are those who build their spirituality around supernatural experiences. Experiences of revelation, prophecy, healing, miracles, blessings from God. And then when we say independent, that's a synonym for non-denominational. So these are networks and leaders and organizations that do not tie themselves to these broader accountability structures. They really are kind of operating out autonomously out there in the world. And when you put those two things together, where charismatic spirituality meets non-denominational governance, what you find is the fastest growing form of Christianity, both around the globe and in the United States today. It is a form of Christianity that is highly ethnically diverse and globally connected, because this is not merely happening in the United States. In fact, this map is showing where the distribution of Pentecostal charismatic Christians are around the world by continent. And if you look, they're especially across the global south, South America, Africa, the subcontinent, and out into Southeast Asia. And this is the realm of televangelists, of celebrity preachers, of mega churches. I sometimes call it the Silicon Valley of the American church. Very innovative, very technologically savvy, very entrepreneurial, willing to move fast, willing to try a lot of things. Very little regulation, very little accountability. Some really wild personalities that are willing to do some pretty extreme things. Now, how do you know if you're looking at an independent charismatic church? Well, here's some of the markers you'll see. One, they emphasize worship a lot in this highly ecstatic and experiential style of worship. If you go to one of these churches, it'll feel more like you're at a rock concert that happens to have a sermon thrown in. These are folks who believe in modern prophecy. Now, most Christians believe in what we would call biblical prophecy, that there are passages in the Bible that allude to future events that have not yet taken place. Most Christians would say they agree with that on some level. These folks believe in that. They also believe in modern prophecy, that there are prophets who walk among us, that there are prophets today who carry the authority of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible to prophesy to individuals and communities and nations the direct words of God. That is a huge radicalizing force. They also have this fixation with the idea of revival and bringing about revival. And if you hear Christians talking about revival, dollars to donuts, they're probably coming out of this strand or influenced by it. They put a strong emphasis on what is called spiritual warfare. This is another very common idea within Christianity, that there are angels and demons that are battling around us for control over the world in this invisible spiritual realm. And Christians believe, or many Christians believe, that that warfare affects us and that we in turn can affect it through prayer, or even at the more extreme ends, performing an exorcism. So again, very common belief. These folks take that to the next level. They also believe in something called the fivefold ministry. And this might sound a little esoteric, but it's very, very important. Most Christians think that there were important leaders in the early church called apostles and prophets. But those are forms of Christian leadership that have died out. These folks say, no, we have apostles and prophets today. We have those forms of authority that can attach directly to God. They don't have to go through Scripture. They don't have to go through denominational hierarchies. One of the other social markers of this world is that they are constantly tracking charismatic media and celebrity culture. That is not merely in the United States. It is a global celebrity culture with thousands of celebrities in it that can rival Hollywood in its scope and its power and its reach. Now, one of the major thinkers in this world was a guy named C. Peter Wagner. And Wagner was a Fuller Seminary professor. I went to Fuller Seminary. I didn't actually overlap with Wagner. He left a little bit before I got there. But he was very influential at Fuller Seminary. It's an evangelical seminary. And he, in the 1980s, became obsessed with this idea of spiritual warfare and decided that he had some new ideas, some new visions for what you could do with spiritual warfare, and began organizing mass campaigns, getting millions of Christians, almost all of them evangelicals, around the globe, praying at the same time for the same causes. And he believed that this was the key to the church moving forward and conquering spiritual territory around the earth. And he came to believe that he was one of these modern day apostles who was sent by God to bring about a global revival that would inaugurate Christian dominion over societies. And so he left Fuller Seminary in 1999, and he went out and started a network called the New Apostolic Reformation. And the NAR was a network of these independent charismatic leaders, all of them identifying as either apostles or prophets or both, and saying that we are going to be the echelon of 21st century leadership in the church that will bring about a global charismatic revival. They sometimes call it the billion soul harvest or the third great awakening, and that will bring about a transformation on the earth. And these were informal networks, relational networks that were mostly tied in with Wagner. And I want to talk for a minute about how NAR theology works. And I recognize that I'm not in a room with theologians, but this is important that you understand this in order to understand how they think about our politics. So they start with this premise that there are modern day apostles and prophets. And if you are not Christian, you might not realize quite how strange that sounds to Christians who are outside of this strand, right? But they believe that God is commissioning new apostles and prophets here in the beginning of the 21st century who are empowered by the Holy Spirit to bring about this global end times revival. Now, they also are reinterpreting one of the most important passages in all of the Christian tradition, Matthew chapter 28, the so-called Great Commission, where Jesus tells his apostles after his resurrection, go into all the world, make disciples of all the nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and I am with you always to the end of the age. And when they read that passage, they say, Jesus told his apostles to disciple nations. Not people, nations. And so the nation becomes the object of Christian mission. As opposed to converting individuals, they want to convert nations, to Christianize nations. Now, how do you Christianize a nation? They were kind of confused about that until early on, this guy Lance Wallnau came along. He's a prophet, an apostle, joined Peter Wagner's circle, and he claimed that he had a prophecy called the Seven Mountain Mandate. The idea of the Seven Mountain Mandate is that in every society, there are 7 arenas of authority: education, family, religion, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. And in every one of those, they imagine it as a mountain. And they say there's spiritual warfare in every one of those mountains. The tops of those mountains, the position of control over education in our society, the position of control over media in our society, is either held by Satan and the demons or God and the Christians. And there's no in between. So if you do not have a Christian leader who is overseeing education in the United States, then Satan's in control of it. Now, how do Christians conquer the 7 mountains? Well, they need to use spiritual warfare, but they also need to be very practical. They need to go into each of the mountains, rise to positions of influence, or co-opt the leaders at the top of those mountains, and then let Christian influence flow down into society. Now, let me just observe that in the rise of the religious right in the 1980s and 1990s, the era of Jerry Falwell and James Dobson and Pat Robertson and these folks, their mentality was, we need to Christianize society from the bottom up. We're the moral majority. And if we can just get enough Christians voting the way that we want them to vote, we can Christianize society. Now, that might be a reprehensible goal, but their agenda and process was still conforming to the rules of liberal democracy. You have to work through elections. You have to work through processes. You have to build a majority. This is not that. This is a top-down, vanguard, revolutionary vision of social change. You take over positions of power from the top and govern from the top down. And so their approach is that the apostles and prophets, and they'll sometimes call them generals of spiritual warfare, are meant to mobilize the church, mobilize Christians to do this work of taking over societies, taking over the 7 mountains, and then building it out as a Christian society. Now, I want to talk about 3 coincidences that happened in 2015 that brought together the New Apostolic Reformation and Donald Trump. The first has to do with this flag, the Appeal to Heaven flag. And in 2013, one of the NAR apostles, a guy named Dutch Sheets, discovered this flag. This is, as we said, this is a flag from the Revolutionary War. It's kind of an obscure piece of Americana. It was commissioned by George Washington to fly over the Massachusetts Navy. And those who are maybe Revolutionary War buffs would have heard of this maybe 20 years ago. It's in history textbooks, that sort of thing. Most of us have probably never seen this thing 20 years ago. But Dutch Sheets discovered this, and he believed that when he saw this flag, he received a prophecy that the United States needs to go through a spiritual revolution led by apostles and prophets with spiritual warfare in order to overthrow liberal tyranny. Remember, this is the very beginning of the second Obama administration, and Dutch Sheets thought that Obama was a Muslim and hated him. And he said, we need to overthrow this liberal tyranny. We have a new King George III, and we need to have a revolution. And so he starts building out a warfare campaign built around the Appeal to Heaven flag, and all of that starts to roll out in the summer of 2015. That's when he publishes his book and really starts rolling out this publicity campaign around the Appeal to Heaven flag. So this flag comes on the scene at the same time that Donald Trump comes on the political scene, and they get interwoven in a way that you couldn't actually have predicted early on. The second coincidence is that as he's entering the presidential race, Donald Trump turns to his trusted spiritual advisor, Paula White-Cain, and says, I want you to be my liaison to the evangelicals. Bring the evangelicals in. I want to talk to them. And this puts Paula White-Cain into an interesting position, because she is not a normal evangelical. She's an independent charismatic. She's a megachurch pastor. She's an apostle. She's a prosperity gospel preacher. And so she starts bringing in her kind of Christian, her kind of evangelical, people who would have been on the fringes of evangelicalism at the time, but these are the first leaders to meet with Trump, are these independent charismatic leaders, apostles and prophets and messianic rabbis and evangelists and megachurch pastors. And one of the people, or a couple of those folks in that group, were NAR leaders, including Lance Wallnau, the Seven Mountains guy. He's in some of these first meetings with Trump. And that leads to the third coincidence. As he is meeting Trump, Wallnau claims that he receives a prophecy. He claims that God tells him that Donald Trump is an Isaiah 45 Cyrus. Okay, you all get it. I'm going to keep moving. No? No? That doesn't make sense to you? You're not well versed in prophecy language. Let me unpack it a little bit. In the Bible, the Jewish people get taken away into exile by the Babylonian Empire. This is in like the 6th century BCE. And then the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persian Empire, and Cyrus is the emperor of the Persian Empire who sends the Jewish people back from Babylon to go rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And so in Isaiah chapter 45, the prophet Isaiah refers to Cyrus as a Mashiach. This is where we get the term Messiah, an anointed one. He's not the Messiah, he's a Messiah. He's a savior to the Jewish people, but he happens to be a secular Messiah. He's Persian, right? He's not Jewish. He's not a person of God, but he's used by God for a purpose. And so what Wallnow is saying to his followers and to broader evangelicalism is Donald Trump is not a good man. He's not a godly man, but he's God's man, to be used for a purpose. And this is what he said later on about this prophecy. I heard the Lord say Donald Trump is Isaiah 45. Cyrus wasn't even one of God's people. He was a Persian, but he was anointed to break down strongholds and fight for Israel. Sound familiar? Trump is a wrecking ball to political correctness, and I believe the hand of God is on him for this season. This becomes the first in a cascade of hundreds of prophecies that have emerged from these circles about Donald Trump, that have built this aura around him, this spiritual aura of significance and anointing and purpose. Now, as they win, as they come into power politically, the NAR and independent charismatic leaders are some of the most ardent Trump supporters, and Paula White stacks Trump's evangelical advisory boards with these independent charismatic leaders. And there's these celebrities who are coming out of the fringes of American evangelicalism, coming out of the hinterlands, the kind of wackadoo parts of American evangelicalism, who are suddenly being brought into the center of the conversation, right? These weird outside populists are being brought into the center of it. Just in the same way that MAGA has revolutionized the Republican Party to the point where the leaders that you would have looked to a decade ago to speak for the Republican Party today are either marginal or might not even call themselves Republicans anymore. The same thing has happened in American evangelicalism. And the leaders, the elite evangelicals, who a decade ago would have been speaking for evangelicalism, have now all been pushed to the margins, and these are the people in the center of the conversation. In my book, I chart how the New Apostolic Reformation became one of the major instigating forces for the Capitol riot through mobilizing their networks with these messages of spiritual warfare. On the day of the Capitol riot, I have tracked more than 60 independent charismatic leaders who were in Washington, D.C. for the riot. There were hundreds of prophecies about Donald Trump that he would win the 2020 election. And when he refused to concede the election, all of these prophecy networks and prophets launched into the prophecies aren't wrong. We just need to do spiritual warfare to fulfill them. And they begin fixating on January 6th and mobilizing their people and saying, you have to be there that day to do battle for Donald Trump in the spiritual realm so that we can push this across the finish line. So Lance Wallnow was there, Cindy Jacobs, one of the most elite prophets of the NAR, Che-On, one of the major apostles, and Dutch Sheets even called into the Capitol riot by speakerphone to prophesy over the U.S. Capitol. On January 6th, you saw Appeal to Heaven flags everywhere. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds of them in the crowds. You could see them at the Trump rally at the Ellipse where Trump and Roger Stone and others spoke. You could see them as the crowd moved across the National Mall over towards the Capitol. You could see them on the front lines as the crowd began to battle with Capitol police officers. There are videos where you can see the Appeal to Heaven flags on tent poles being used to beat down on the Capitol police officers. We know that at least one of the rioters wore an Appeal to Heaven flag as a cape around his neck. And when the police later came to arrest him, they found the Appeal to Heaven flag, and it was spattered in blood and in mace. And he said, that's not my blood. So what has happened over the last decade is there's been a MAGA spirituality that has formed. And the center of that spirituality is this idea that Donald Trump is this messianic figure. He is anointed for office to save America. And how was that constructed? How was that built? Well, you had these prophecies that NAR leaders put forward that have cast him in that light as an anointed one. You have this spiritual warfare concept that says that our politics is an arena of cosmic combat between good and evil. That's not healthy in a democracy to think purely in terms of Manichaean good and evil, but this is how they think. With these appeal to heaven flags that have been wedded to Trump and to his message. And with these revival-focused worship events, if you watched the Charlie Kirk funeral, it was very much inspired by independent charismatic spirituality and styles of rhetoric. And then the Seven Mountains. And one of the manifestations that we see in the Seven Mountains all around us is in the interim between the two Trump administrations, the mountain they chose to focus most on was education. And so this is why so many Christians have been going after school boards and library boards and trying to take over school districts, because they see education as crucial to building their Christian America. Now, in my book, The Violent Taken by Force, I track 7 of these leaders: Paula White-Cain, Peter Wagner, Cindy Jacobs, Che On, Lance Wallnau, Sean Foyt, and Dutch Sheets, and trying to understand, where did they come from? How did they get these ideas? How did these ideas become embedded within the Trump administrations? And then how have they created this spirituality that drives people to something like January 6th? So as I close, I want to talk about what we see happening right now. Hopefully I've just given you a decoder ring to think about and understand how what you see in the headlines matches up with these forces of religious extremism. I'm going to highlight very quickly 5 themes that we see going on right now, 5 trends that we're experiencing right now, and then I'm going to close with what I think we can do about it. So let me run through these really quick just so you know what they are before we get to them. First, this ratcheting up of charismatic prophecy rhetoric in the second Trump administration. It started in the 24 election and is very much ongoing. Second, Christian supremacy and how it's shaping the Trump administration domestic and foreign policy. Third, these surges in Christian radicalization, especially in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Fourth, the adoption of independent charismatic spirituality by the militia movement. And fifth is this emerging civil war that we see between the so-called philo-Semitic and anti-Semitic elements in the far right. Let me go through those one by one. First, about this charismatic prophecy. So in the 2016 election, the Cyrus image was really, really gravitational for why evangelicals voted for Trump. It gave them a rationale to say, he's not a good man, but he's anointed. He's not one of us, but he will govern on our behalf. But the Cyrus image is not violent. Cyrus, at least in the way that he relates to the people of Israel, the Jewish people, he just sends them back to go and rebuild. He just kind of commissions them, right? And so the Cyrus image is an image of protection. Now, as you get into the 2024 election, they started ramping this up more. And they'd already, by this point, there were hundreds of these prophecies about Trump. But the one that rose to the fore right before the 24 election is about Jehu. And Jehu is a much, much scarier figure than Cyrus. Jehu might be one of the scariest figures in the Bible. Because Jehu was the king of Israel, but before Jehu was a king and a queen named Ahab and Jezebel. And they're kind of the paradigmatically evil characters in the Hebrew Bible. They're like the really baddies, right? They were the pagans who led the Jewish people into pagan practices. And so, when King Ahab dies, Jehu is anointed king, but Jezebel's still alive. And as you got into the beginning of as Kamala Harris became the candidate in the 24 election, suddenly you started hearing all this rhetoric comparing her to Jezebel. Now, they were also saying that about Hillary Clinton, right? But it's a much more convenient foil for them. And they'll often talk about the spirit of Jezebel, by which they mean anything negative that they can associate with anything feminine. Abortion, homosexuality, sexual perversion, whatever, anything that they can kind of castigate as bad femininity, that's Jezebel. And so if Kamala Harris is a Jezebel, they started saying Donald Trump is a Jehu. Now, what does Jehu do to Jezebel in the story? So Ahab dies, Jezebel's still alive, and she's secluded in a tower with her servants. And as the story goes, Jehu and his commanders ride up on their horses, and he commands her servants to throw her out of the tower. And they do. And she hits the ground and she dies. And then he tramples her body with his horse. And he goes and has a meal, and the wild dogs come and eat Jezebel's body while he's having a meal. And the message of the story, this is 2 Samuel 9, the message of the story is Jezebel is such a profane human being that she has to be reduced to dog feces and all memory of her wiped from the earth. This was the analogy that they were using in the lead up to the 2024 election to say Donald Trump is a Jehu, Kamala Harris is a Jezebel, and we need Jezebel to be cast down so the Jehu can rise up. And about a week before the election, Donald Trump gathered with his religious advisors in Florida at an event sponsored by Turning Point USA, and Messianic Rabbi Jonathan Cahn, maybe the most prominent Messianic Jew in the world, got up and, speaking with Trump in the front row, started prophesying directly to him. And this is what he said: "Mr. President, I speak of the mystery of your life. God called you to walk according to the template of Jehu. Jehu came to the capital city with an agenda to drain the swamp. Jehu was born to make his nation great again by turning it back to God." What does he mean, drain the swamp? Well, after he presides over the annihilation of Jezebel, Jehu goes on a rampage and begins killing anyone who was associated with Ahab and Jezebel. He kills their entire family. He piles their children's heads up at the city gates. And it is one of the most brutal stories in the Hebrew Bible. This is how you condition evangelical Christians who believe that it is their duty to love their neighbors and love their enemies, that it is okay and you must accept the violence that Donald Trump will bring, because it's not just that there's a comparison. He has a template. He has a biblical script he has to follow in order to do the will of God. He's going to have to be violent. That's the message. Second, how Christian supremacy is shaping the second Trump administration's domestic and foreign policy. On the same day that he appointed Paula White as the head of the White House Faith Office, Donald Trump also announced his new anti-Christian bias task force. Eradicating anti-Christian bias is the goal of this task force. It is staffed by many, many people who are in his cabinet. It is headquartered out of the Department of Justice, so you know that it has some actual prosecutorial teeth to it. And what they're doing right now is trying to identify all the forms of anti-Christian bias that are in our government. 62% of our country is Christian. When a religious majority in a society claims they are persecuted, watch out. Because that is the predicate for them persecuting other people. Today in India, where the population is about 80% Hindu, there's all this talk of Hindu phobia. All these people talking about there's rampant Hindu phobia in India. Now, Hindu phobia is a real thing in the United States, where about 1% of the population is Hindu and they experience real discrimination. But in India, where 80% of the population is Hindu, why do they talk about Hindu phobia? It's so that they can go and beat up on the minority Muslim population who they claim is persecuting them. And today in India, there are pogroms and lynchings and mob violence against Muslim minorities, all in the name of stopping Hindu phobia. We have the Pentagon has been posting propaganda videos, recruitment videos that are using biblical passages, often voiced by Pete Hegseth. And Donald Trump just this week has started saying that there's a Christian genocide going on in Nigeria. There is not. And that he is going to protect Christianity in Nigeria, potentially sending in troops. Do not be shocked if you start seeing American military forces being deployed to Nigeria in the coming months, or at least bombing campaigns. They've started to promise that. Third, we've seen surges in Christian radicalization, especially in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination. In January of 2024, a colleague of mine, Paul Jupe, and I, we put in the field a survey to see how far some of these NAR ideas had spread. And we identified 7 of the core NAR ideas. These were all ideas that were quite fringy within evangelicalism, even 15 years ago. I grew up evangelical. I never heard this stuff. But on 6 out of the 7 ideas, more than 50% of American evangelicals said they agree with these ideas. Things like the 7 mountains, things like the idea of the Third Great Awakening, things like apostles and prophets and spiritual warfare in our politics and territorial demons. And as these folks have seen the Charlie Kirk assassination, they have, obviously that was a horrible, horrible thing that happened. It should not happen in a liberal democracy. We should not have assassinations. If you support that kind of violence, don't tell me that you're pro-democracy. But in the wake of that, it has been a propaganda coup for the far right. And they have leveraged all their networks and all their power and the power of the federal government to spread this message that Charlie Kirk was a moderate, mainstream Christian. He was not. He was a far-right political activist and a Christian supremacist who was promoting these messages around the world. Fourth, the adoption of independent charismatic spirituality by the militia movement. I've been watching over the last few years, especially on the West Coast, as the militia movement, these anti-government folks with the big guns and the big trucks who march in formation, those folks are adopting this revival in spiritual warfare and apostles and prophets rhetoric. There's services now happening in some churches led by Proud Boy pastors that are baptizing Proud Boys. They're not baptizing them out of the Proud Boys, they're baptizing them into the Proud Boys. And so Christian initiation symbols, Christian rhetoric is being layered into the anti-government mentalities and far-right ideation of the militia movement. If you want to not sleep well tonight, go and look up Matt Shea, M-A-T-T-S-H-E-A. He's a Washington state former legislator who's a far-right extremist and militia activist who was actually kicked out of the Washington state legislature by his own Republican caucus, who denounced him and referred him to the FBI on charges of domestic terrorism. He hangs out with the NAR guys on the West Coast. Apostle Derek Gates ran for Congress a little bit ago. He is a devotee of the NAR, one of the apostles of the NAR. That's him marching with a long gun next to a far-right California governor candidate. Che On, the apostle over Derek Gates, is currently running for California governor. Maybe one of the most influential NAR apostles in the world running for California governor right now. Last point. This emerging civil war that we see between the philo-Semitic and the anti-Semitic far right. Let me define those terms. So I think you're probably familiar with anti-Semitism, right? It's the idea that Jews are different than the rest of humanity, and therefore we're supposed to hate them and distance ourselves from them and maybe even persecute them because they're not like the rest of us humans. Philo-Semitism is the other side of the coin. Jews are different than the rest of humanity. They're special, and therefore we love them and care about them. Now, many people would say, oh, anti-Semitism is bad, but maybe philo-Semitism, that doesn't sound so bad. You're loving people. Except there's a fundamental dehumanizing move that is the premise of all of this, that Jews are different than the rest of humanity. And once you've made that dehumanizing move, everything else is just about your mood, how you feel about Jews being different from the rest of humanity. And so within the far right, there's a large coalition that is philo-Semitic, often called Christian Zionist. They're Christians who support the state of Israel for theological reasons. And then there's this anti-Semitic coalition represented by Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens and some of that crowd. And those two are rivals now. And they're battling right now for control over who is guiding the Trump coalition, because both sides kind of see Trump as a cipher that is connected to their side. And they're battling right now rhetorically for how acceptable anti-Semitism is in the far right. And I'm not talking about light anti-Semitism like, Jews kind of control a lot of the financial empire. That's kind of like ground level anti-Semitism. It's dangerous. They are outright citing Nazism. Right? These texts that got leaked to Politico of the young Republicans, it is straight up Nazism. And then on the other side, you have these Christian Zionists pushing back. Okay, what can we do about all this? Right now, I would argue that we are a country that is divided into thirds. 1/3 of the country, I would argue, is deep into MAGA. Coming into the 2024 election, 1/3 of Americans consistently in polls was saying that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. In order to believe that, you have to believe conspiracy theories, because there's zero evidence for that. And yet 1/3 of our fellow citizens believe that. They do not live in reality. They are locked into these propaganda bubbles. Now, this coalition is mostly rural and exurban and suburban. Many of them are overtly Christian supremacists and white supremacists, and they buy into these conspiracy theories, and they're virtually unreachable in terms of persuasion. Those are the people that will not abandon Trump, even if he takes us into World War III. Now, the other side of the country, or the other side of the spectrum, is probably where most of us in this room are. We live in the liberal mainstream media bubble. Now, to our credit, we live in reality. It's a pretty inclusive group. It's liberal Christians and seculars and people of other religions. These are mostly college educated and financially stable people. And we live in factual reality, but we have a narrow cultural consensus. And we tend to think that our way of viewing the world is erudite and thoughtful and compassionate and generous. But if you disagree with us, you're just wrong. And the rest of the country views us as smug. And they're mostly right. In the middle is the middle third, and they're the hardest to define because there's not much that unites them other than that they're very disaffected right now and very confused. These are people who live all over the map. They live in cities, they live in suburbs, they live in rural areas. Some of them are Christians. Some of them are these nuns, these N-O-N-E-S, right? The people who've left religion, not necessarily become explicitly atheists, but they don't want to be any of the above. They're disillusioned. They're downtrodden and angry with American politics and institutions, and they have this chaotic media and information diet. They're not getting their news from NPR. Maybe they're getting it through Twitter. Maybe they're getting it through YouTube. Maybe they're getting it through Joe Rogan. And the whole ball game of American democracy is how do you isolate and defeat MAGA? And these theologies of Christian supremacy that we just talked about are pulling more and more people into that MAGA coalition and hardening Trump's hold on them. And so the only possible winning coalition against MAGA is to unite the other two-thirds, to build bridges between these two-thirds. And for those of us in the blue bubble, that means understanding people in the middle, means getting into relationship with them and learning from them what they need. What is not working in American society and American democracy that some of them would be willing to vote for Donald Trump? And how do we persuade them that there are better options? That is the task of the next 3 or 4 years. How do we get there? Well, at the risk of being slightly melodramatic, I think that the ability to call ourselves a democracy hinges on the 2026 election. If the anti-MAGA coalition cannot take over and seat at least one House of Congress in 2026, I think the 2028 election is basically a moot point. Because part of the role of authoritarian governments, part of the playbook, is that they rig elections. There's a lot of ways to rig an election. And when a political coalition in a democracy tells you that the last election was rigged, that is their promise to rig the next one. Because they're saying the system is rigged against us, we're going to change the system so that we are at an advantage. So we need to get a majority in at least one of the houses of Congress to start holding them accountable and arresting this slide into authoritarianism. And so if we're going to do that, we need the most big tent, inclusive, everyone you can think of coalition that we can build. And that needs to be a big tent that has no purity tests, that has no shibboleths, that has no kind of, this is the ideological thing that you have to agree to, other than if you think that Donald Trump is an authoritarian threat to the United States, if you think we should have basic equality of everyone in our society, you're with us. Whatever your views on LGBTQ rights, whatever your views on charter schools, whatever your views on abortion, if you are opposed to the authoritarian threat, you're with us. And it is our task to keep them with us, because we need them. If we have a democracy in 4 years, we can have vibrant public debates about LGBTQ rights and about abortion and about charter schools and all the other things that are very important to people in the blue bubble. If we don't have a democracy, there will not be a debate, and you will not like what the other side does. So we need to save our democracy first. And how do we do that? Well, our country is about 30% non-religious, about 8% religions other than Christianity, and about 62% Christian. And we need all those groups in our coalition. And each of us needs to persuade our own communities. So if you're Jewish, you need to speak Jewishly to your fellow Jews about what the values of your tradition are and how those lead you to being supportive of democracy and equality and freedom. And if you're Muslim, the same. If you're Hindu and Buddhist, the same. If you are atheist and agnostic, you have a hard task, because there are about 30% of our country, maybe 20% of those are Christians who've left being Christian because they're disillusioned with institutions. I'm sorry, we screwed them up. But now they're in your camp. And you need to find ways to enlist them and say, this matters. and speak language that speaks to them. And Christians, for those in the room who are Christian like me, we have the hardest task. Because it's not merely about enlisting and persuading, it's about fighting. We need to have a theological argument. These people are doing this in the name of Christ, and in my name and your name. And if that doesn't make you indignant, then I don't know that you should call yourself a Christian. But if it does, then let's present a better vision for what our society can be. Thank you. Thank you. Yep.
Because the neighbor called the park police. If you are too close to a driveway, if you park it in a disabled spot, if you park by the fire hydrant, you have tickets on your cars, and we can't know for sure that a tow truck won't stop. I have photos of several cars, but possibly not all of them. But if you push the envelope, I can tell you there was a red sedan, Hyundai, a silver VW crossover, a Ford Taurus, a silver hatchback Prius. I have the photos. So sorry to interrupt, but I recommend you check your phone.
I will say people in Baltimore aren't very good at parking, but I'm not terribly impressed with the Minneapolis folks either. So.
All right, thank you so much. What a great presentation. Appreciate it, and thank you all. As humanists, we have some questions.
Great. I like questions.
So this first question says, hi, Matthew. How can we make a distinction between religions that promote extremism versus religions that are interpreted that way?
It's a fair question. I would say it's never one or the other. In every religious tradition, there's a potentiality for extremism. There's also a potentiality for inclusion and love and service. That lives within, right? It's the same thing as saying, where in the humanist tradition would you find things that would lead to extremism and things that would lead into inclusion and compassion? You can find both. That's how traditions work. That's how rhetoric and discourse works. So in every religious tradition, there is this impulse. I mean, especially any religious tradition that's been around for hundreds of years, right, that has contained millions of people, well, there's going to be a lot of people in there who attach themselves to it because of messages that are humanizing, and other people who attach themselves to it because of messages that are dehumanizing and that they want to draw out of it. So there's no like sorting things into good religion and bad religion. Each religion contains that possibility within it, and that's why we need religious voices to push back on the worst elements within their own community, right? Because those voices have integrity within the tradition. So I think we need to be very careful about trying to kind of decide, oh, this is one of the good religions over here, and we're going to focus on that. Just to give you an example, many Americans think of Buddhism as a peaceful religious tradition that is only inclusive and kind. But if you go to Myanmar or Sri Lanka today, you'll find Buddhist nationalist monks who are leading people in pogroms against other communities. That's not a knock against Buddhism. It's just saying Buddhism is a religious tradition, just like Islam, just like Christianity, just like Judaism, right? The traditions contain the possibility of both. And so it's more about eliciting the good from within the tradition than negatively categorizing traditions one way or the other.
Thank you. This one says, I've heard in Christian communities of social systems and activities that exist in parallel to secular life. And they give some examples. Summer camp becomes Christian summer camp. Yep. Ballet becomes Christian ballet, and so forth. So how much of it is harmless and how much of that is harmful?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of it's harmless. I mean, if you think about what religion is, right, we all have layers to our identity, right? Our sexuality, our nationality and ethnicity, our politics, our race, our social location, socioeconomic status, education, all those are parts of who we are. And the way that we relate to religion, whether we are religious or non-religious, is a layer of that identity, right? For you all, I'm assuming, I don't know if some of you are religious, but for those who are not, it's probably, I don't identify as religious, and yet you're still showing up here because you want community with other people who don't identify as religious, right? So it's a part of your identity to be a humanist. It's part of my identity to be a Christian, right? Now, for those people who are religious, religion is about making meaning of the world. And so it's a part of our identity that does not neatly segregate. Because I want to make sense of my sexuality and my race and my history, my nationality, all those things get attached and tied in with how I think about religion. Doesn't mean I'm a religious nationalist, it just means I use religious categories to think about those things. And so for Christians who want to do Christian ballet, I don't see any great harm to society about there being Christian ballet, as long as it's inclusive and open to other people. Now where it gets dangerous is when people want to start using religion to exclude people from those things. Or to say, we have the real version of this because we are Christian, and what you have is fake, or what you have is false, or what you have is demonic, right? So again, religion can be a force for humanization. It can also be a force for dehumanization, and it really is about how the people are using it. So I think in the large part, that stuff is very benign, but it can get very concerning, especially when you consider what people are doing. We are going to take over the school board as Christians. Hold on a minute. That's a public good. That's for all of us. That's not a Christian good. So I think, especially when we're talking about public issues and public activism, I get very concerned when I see Christians saying Christians need to take this over in public, because that is anti-democratic, because democracy means everyone participates.
This question asks, is the mainstream Democratic establishment trying too hard to outcompete the GOP at conservatism? That word, conservatism, I got there. It says, for example, Ezra Klein recently proposed running anti-abortion Democrats, reluctance to embrace Mamdani, Kamala being anti-immigrant, pro-Israel, just no new exciting ideas, just anti-Trump.
I'm a religious studies scholar and theologian. I'm not a political scientist. So I am deeply politically and ideologically neutral when it comes to what is a winning coalition. I don't know. I don't know if Joe Manchin or Zoran Mamdani would be a better candidate for Democrats to run in 2028. I don't know that. I would vote for either of them. So I think we can get very hung up on, okay, I've got an idea for what is the winning coalition, and I'm going to tell you what the winning coalition is, and then we need to go and build that winning coalition. And I hear a lot of people who are out there saying that, Ezra Klein and others, and my response is, I don't know what the winning coalition is, but I want to be a part of it. And I want to help build it. And I think it's probably going to look differently in different places. I don't think that it's going to work for Democrats to say we need to win 50 or 25 states, Senate, and so we're just going to run only anti-abortion candidates. To me, that does not seem like that's going to work, because that's not how those states work. And that's the system that we have. Is that a purely democratic system? No. But we got to play it as it lays. And so I believe we should build a big tent coalition that includes everyone. And I mean everyone. Everyone from Zoran Mamdani all the way to Joe Manchin. That needs to be the coalition. And that all those people don't have to agree with each other on everything. We just need them all in agreement that Trump is a threat to the order of our society. That's the message. And there could be all kinds of other messages about economics, whatever it takes to win that coalition. I'm in favor of it. I truly do not care. We can have those debates in a decade if we still have a democracy. If we don't have a democracy, it doesn't matter.
This question says, how do the male and white Christian nationalist leadership justify allowing some women in positions of leadership or power like Paula?
Yeah, so, and this is why it's important to recognize the different strands of this stuff. In the hardline Catholic far-right radical traditionalist camp, it's almost all male leaders. They're almost all priests and kind of male influencers. In the Reformed Calvinist camp, it's almost all male white leaders because they're largely racist and bearded. In the independent charismatic space, Pentecostals and charismatics have always been comfortable with females in leadership. It's always been true since the rise of Pentecostalism in the early 20th century. Many mainline Protestants are very proud that they have female pastors. I got bad news for them. The Pentecostals beat them there by about 50 years. And so Paula White is a very, very empowered female religious leader. So is Cindy Jacobs. So are many of the other leaders in this room. Now, how do they justify it? Well, this is one of the rivalries and tensions, the internecine squabbles between these groups, is that some of them are okay with this. When Trump appointed Paula White as the head of the White House Faith Office, Doug Wilson went on his podcast and started mocking her and saying, oh, he put a woman in there? Maybe she's going to give him another prophecy. He was mocking her. But he still works with her because he has to, because she's the gatekeeper. So these folks have gotten very, very good at sublimating their differences, setting them aside, papering them over, so that they can all pursue power together. But their agendas are different. And I think we also need to be thinking about what are the fissures among the far right, these things like philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, and that's a very, very good place to drive the wedge. Because the more that they are divided, the more that they're battling with each other, the less they are implementing Stephen Miller's policy agenda. And the more distracted we can make Stephen Miller, the better. Because he only has nefarious ends in his enactment. So the more that they can be fighting amongst themselves, the better it is for the rest of us. Yeah.
This person asks, I can see why the government endorsing religion is an issue, but why is it an issue for a church to hang the U.S. flag?
Well, as I said, I don't give a whip whether churches have American flags in them. It does not bother me. My church does it, apparently, I just found this out, they do it from Memorial Day until Veterans Day. And this was a hard-fought negotiation, apparently, that they would do this. I actually, apparently they do it. I didn't notice it. It's a pretty small flag, apparently. So for some people, for some Christians, it's seen as a form of idolatry. That you are inserting a national symbol into this religious space and putting it among a kind of constellation of religious symbols. And so therefore implicitly attaching religious significance to it. I see that argument. I don't really care one way or the other because it doesn't signal anything to me whether a church has an American flag or not. It doesn't tell me really anything about the church. I've been in mainline Protestant churches that have it. I've been in evangelical churches that don't. So it's more of an idiosyncratic thing that often lands on the internal political debates within the congregation, much more than it signals anything more broadly about the church.
This person really loved your presentation.
Oh, good.
And they wanted to know where they can find references for this type of information.
Well, you could read my book. So in terms of the NAR material, most of that is coming out of my book. Some of the narrative in my book really ends with January 6th and the immediate aftermath of January 6th. And so some of the stuff I was talking about at the end here was not in there. I also did a podcast. If you aren't, I shouldn't say this, but if you aren't really keen on paying for the book, I did a podcast called Charismatic Revival Fury. That's free, that covers a lot of the same material as is in my book. So if you are like, I really want to know more about this, but I don't have, Rachel, how's it, like $35 or whatever the book is tonight, fine, just go listen to the podcast. That's great. I'd appreciate it. In terms of other references, there are some very good books that have been written recently on this. I recommend to you Catherine Stewart's books, Power Worshippers and Money, Lies, and God, that just came out recently. Brad Onishi has a good book, Preparing for War. There's a whole bunch of good literature. I mean, some of it on the back table there. Amanda Tyler has a really good book on how to end Christian nationalism. She is the national chair of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So there's a lot of good stuff out there, and if people need more recommendations, I can definitely give more.
1 second. Right here. Okay. So we'll make this the last question because we're running up against time. I wish we had all the time in the world to ask all the questions, but there was a number of questions kind of around this question, this idea of like Trump's power, or given that Trump's power hangs on being this messianic fulfillment of prophecy, what happens to the coalition when he dies?
It's a very good question. I get asked it a lot, and my honest answer is I don't know. If Trump died tomorrow, I don't know what would happen. I mean, obviously, J.D. Vance would become president, right? Like that we know. In terms of the spiritual and kind of emotional leadership of the coalition, I don't think that Vance is very well calibrated for that. He doesn't have charisma in any sense, and he's very steeped in this kind of far-right Catholicism, but he's a very hard time translating that to Protestant audiences. And so, and he's also very deeply in bed with some of the nefarious forces within Silicon Valley. So it's entirely possible that he could be put into that position. I just don't think that he has the capacity for maintaining the hold on that coalition that Trump has through his kind of natural abilities and his kind of ambiguity ideologically. If you'd asked me this question 6 months ago, and some reporters did, I would have said that I wouldn't look at the elected officials in terms of who would be able to inherit the coalition. I would look at media figures like Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk, because I think media figures tend to be much more savvy on the attentional dimensions of our economy that Trump is very good at, keeping your attention on certain things. That's what these media figures are very good at. And Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk were, while he was still alive, Kirk was very talented at that. Very talented at knowing where things were going and moving in that direction and pushing and kind of catching the right wind. And he's very, very good at speaking to different Christian audiences and kind of bridging amongst these different strands of Christian supremacy. And there were a number of far-right commentators after his assassination who said that Republicans lost a future president when he died, and I don't think they were far off. I think he really was one of the real rising stars, and that's part of why it was such a visceral reaction to his assassination, was that he was kind of universally liked across their whole coalition. I don't know where this goes. And Tucker Carlson himself, since the Kirk assassination, has really leaned hard into anti-Semitism, which I think is very alienating to a lot of people in that coalition. So we may not have seen a leader emerge. I will say this. If you're hoping that, boy, this is going to be a hard time in a second Trump administration, but if we can just get our people in 2028, it'll all be over, I'm here to disabuse you of that optimism. This is the sort of stuff that takes generations to work its way through the system of a society. And even when you win elections, it doesn't mean that you win permanently. And the amount of damage that they have done in the last 10 months between Doge and the decimation of the Justice Department, the drumming out of the Pentagon of all generals who will not agree immediately with all of Pete Hegseth's orders, those are going to take decades to rebuild and repair in the best of circumstances if you don't have a Supreme Court that's in hock to the far right. So this is going to be a struggle that will probably last most of the rest of our lives. A struggle against Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy, a struggle for American democracy, a struggle for equality and dignity for all people. We have entered a new phase in American history. And I would say that we have not faced a greater threat to American democracy as the one we see in the second Trump administration since at least the Civil War. And at least in the Civil War, half or more of the country believed in the original founding principles and were fighting for them. And so I think we need to be serious and sober-minded about this. That doesn't mean despairing. There's still politics in authoritarian states. Authoritarians still lose elections because they overreach and miscalculate, and because people still have voices and have power if we can get them mobilized and help them understand the threat that they're facing. Because right now, they are largely being, the apathy and the sense of disillusionment and fear and hopelessness that we see in our country is being cultivated through the propaganda. In the 20th century, these totalitarian and authoritarian states, the model was there's a central ideology, and you get everyone aligned with it or everyone afraid of it. And if that central ideology is communism, then you build the communist state and keep everyone else afraid. Or if that ideology is fascism, kind of a far-right Nazi ideology, then you get everyone in line or afraid of it. That's not how modern authoritarianism works. Modern authoritarianism is more like what we see in modern-day Russia. It's about controlling the information that people have and convincing them that either there is no truth, that they can't know what is true, or that even if they know, it's not worth fighting for. And if you can get people into that mindset, then the government elites and the oligarchs and the autocrat can make a lot of money and keep everyone quiet. They don't have to use violence because people are so atomized and disconnected. And so the antidote to that is building relationships locally in your neighborhood. And I'll say this, what we need in order to build this coalition is a mass campaign of persuasion, of persuading the people who either didn't vote in the last election, and we should make it normal in our small talk, to, as we're meeting people, to say, are you a voter? But we also need to mobilize people who voted for Trump and are willing to admit that they were wrong about that. And we need to not castigate them when they say that they were wrong. We need to celebrate them when they say they were wrong and say, great, you're with us now. Welcome to the coalition, right? We're not going to hold that past against you because we need you now. And so we need a campaign of mass persuasion. And if you aren't in relationship with people who voted for Donald Trump, then you're not part of the solution. Thank you.
All right, thanks again for being here, everybody. Again, social hour happening in the back of the room. Great books being for sale back there. Please head back and grab a book. Matt will be back there signing books. And if you can help us cover the costs of some of our refreshments back there, feel free to make a donation. Thank you so much.